Steve Klauke, voice of the Salt Lake Bees and the Weber State Wildcats. Thank you so much for being part of Three Questions.
I appreciate the invitation, Bob.
How close are you to doing what you wanted to do when you grew up, when you were in high school?
I'm doing what I wanted to do. It doesn't matter what level. Sure, as a kid, you dreamed of being in Major League Baseball or the NBA or the NFL, but just to be able to be the voice of a team like the Bees or like Weber State is something I'd always wanted to do. I was the nerd in the neighborhood that instead of listening to the two top 40 radio stations in Chicago, I had my transistor plugged into Cubs games, White Sox games, Bears games. I was picking up KMOX in St. Louis to listen to the Cardinals, WBZ in Boston to listen to the Red Sox or Tigers games out of Detroit, just because I wanted to listen and enjoy listening to all the different broadcasters.
Names like Vince Scully and Harry Carey and all those guys, who did you model your style of play-by-play after?
If I have to pick one, it would be the Hall of Famer Jack Brickhouse, who for many years not only was the TV voice of the Cubs and the White Sox both, but he also was the radio voice of the Chicago Bears, and he was the TV voice of the Chicago Bulls their very first season. Just because he did so many sports and did so many well, I never wanted to be pigeonholed into one sport. I wanted to be able to do all of them, and I've done football, I've done baseball, I've done basketball. I've even filled in for 40 games back in the late 90s for the Grizzlies and done hockey.
Oh, so let me ask you then. You've done baseball for the Bees for a long time. You've done football. You've done basketball for Weber State. You've done hockey as well. What is the difference between play-by-play for football, baseball, basketball, and hockey? What are the nuances?
I would say pacing is the biggest thing, because baseball is a slow sport. A lot of time in between pitches, sometimes time in between batters. You have to become a storyteller, and I try to tell stories based on what's happening in baseball today or going back in time to the 90s when the Buzz were around and the Minnesota Twins affiliate and some unknown named David Ortiz, later to be Big Papi, was hitting home runs for the Salt Lake Buzz. Basketball is obviously fast-paced. Hockey's fast-paced. Football, it's fast-paced within the play, but you do get a chance to take a breath after the play, you know, say, okay, gain of 2 yards, it's now 3rd down and 8, and at that point you shut up and let the analyst analyze what just happened, and I tell the analyst usually as soon as they break the huddle and go into formation, that's when I take over, so I can set the formation on the radio for the listeners at home so they know it's 2 wide receivers to the left, 1 wide receiver to the right.
For the Bees, you have been doing play-by-play since 1994, is
Yes.
that correct? That's a long time. Have you been solo all that time, and are you solo by choice?
I'm not solo by choice so much, just nobody wants to pay a second guy. No, I've had partners before, but only on the television side. Minor League Baseball, they don't really spend a whole lot of money when it comes to the broadcasters. There are some teams that will use 2 broadcasters at home, but only the main guy on the road. It just happened to work out that way that I've been by myself for the entire 25 years.
For the Salt Lake Bees, you have been a play-by-play announcer for the last, I don't know, since 1994. And you've been solo that entire time. I mean, most other folks have a spotter, an analyst, a color man. What is it like going solo, and what are the challenges of announcing play-by-play solo?
Probably the biggest challenge is to make sure there are no lulls. Now, baseball is a game of pace, and you can let it breathe. Be quiet for 2 or 3 innings. Let the people at home, you know, hear the popcorn vendor selling his ware or a fan yelling out at the field because the pitcher's not working fast enough. But as a whole, you let that breathe, and then I keep a 4x6 index card on every player in the league, so I have notes on everybody. So I use the time in between pitches. I kind of move from play-by-play to kind of analyzing what's going on, or be a storyteller and try to give background stories about the guys who are out there, or maybe try to be funny. There was a guy named Pete LaForest on the Portland Beavers one time, and there was kind of a lull. It was a 10-1 game. Nothing was happening, and so I just made up a story about the fact that this kid, when he was in junior high, won the hide-and-seek competition 3 years in a row because you couldn't see LaForest for the trees.
Oh, shit. Of all of the games that you have called in your career, particularly for the Bees, which one stands out in your mind as the most memorable?
Probably it was a game in 1998 where New Orleans scored 9 runs in the top of the first. The Buzz scored 8 runs in the bottom of the first. It took 52 minutes to play the first inning. And that night, Joe Garagiola was in town with his anti-spit tobacco campaign. And he popped his head into my booth and said, "Steve, that was the strangest inning I've ever seen." I said, and quoting his book, I go, "Joe, baseball's a funny game." And as it turns out, not only did the Buzz win the game on a 3-run homer by Scott Stahoviak in the bottom of the 9th, that also gave him the cycle, which was one of the first in franchise history. So that game really stands out. If there's a number 2, it was during the regular season game also in 1998. During the NBA Finals, I had gotten a call from the Jazz saying, "Hey, can you leave 10 tickets for Bob Costas?" I said, "Sure. Would Bob be willing to come up and join me for an inning?" And they said, "Sure." Well, 3rd inning, 4th inning, 5th inning rolls around. There's no Bob Costas. And I find out that he never showed up, and neither did his group.
Oh.
But in the 6th inning, the door to my booth opens. I'm wondering who's walking into the booth during the middle of the game. And I look over my shoulder. It's Brent Musburger.
Oh.
And so the inning ends, and I introduced myself. He says, "Oh, yeah, Steve, I was driving back from Park City listening to the game, so I thought I'd stop by and say hi."
Oh,
so
my.
I asked him if he would join me on the air, and he was more than willing to, and I promised I wouldn't tell the story that when he made the move from radio and newspaper in Chicago to television to play up his Montana upbringing, they made him wear a denim shirt and a bolo tie during the sports on the 10 o'clock news.
Oh, you're kidding. Well, speaking of the major leagues, your peers in sports play-by-play here in Utah say that you could very easily slip right into the major league booth and no one would bat an eye, that you are definitely major league talent. Why haven't you gone to the majors?
Well, there's only 60 such positions available in radio in Major League Baseball, and so it's very, very competitive. And once anybody gets one of those positions, they are not very willing to give it up. So I knew it would be a hard task to try to get to that level. I was very fortunate in 2004. I got to do 4 innings in 2 games for the Toronto Blue Jays, and then 2 years ago, the Angels called me up to do the entire broadcast for a 3-game series in Seattle and a 3-game series in Baltimore. And if I never get a chance to go back again, I'll always treasure the memories of doing those 6 games in the big leagues for the Angels.
How much preparation does it take you before each game? I would imagine that there is an awful lot of institutional knowledge that you have built up over the years, but you still have to go through game prep. What do you do in game prep, and how long does it take you?
Well, generally, let's say on a road game, I'll spend half of my morning updating all my books and numbers and notes from those numbers. And that, like I say, takes about an hour and a half. And then after lunch, I'll rest for a little bit. And then about 2 o'clock in the afternoon for a 7 o'clock game, I'll be at the ballpark already. And I'll be perusing the game notes. I'll go down to our clubhouse and talk to our manager and talk to the players just to find out little tidbits, what's going on with them, if there's any funny stories, just something to keep things going during the broadcast. My goal is to at least 4 or 5 times a game say, well, I was talking to such and such player down by the batting cage before the game, and we were talking about, and then tell a story that relates to that. So I guess it's a broadcast where the preparation is a few hours during the day and 25 years in the making.
When you are speaking with the manager of the club or with one of the players or that kind of thing, I would imagine it's a different kind of exchange than when they are interacting with fans who come to see them on the field or afterwards. Tell me about that relationship between you and the team members.
I've always thought it's been a pretty good one. Obviously, it changed over the years because of the age differential growing and growing. I used to, maybe back in the 90s with the team, go out to lunch with some of the players and what have you. That doesn't really happen anymore for 2 reasons. I think the age difference, as I mentioned, and the electronic leashes that everybody has called cell phones, because they're all locked into that these days. But it's just a matter of, hey, how you doing? Hey, what happened on this particular pitch the other day? Or here in Nashville, for example, the ball doesn't carry as well. Do you, as an outfielder, play in maybe a little bit closer because the ball doesn't carry? And that particular outfielder told me I can't because there's a white room with fluorescent lights behind home plate, so I can't see the ball off the bat as well, so I can't cheat in. So little things like that are something that I can learn and then pass along to the listeners.
Have you ever contemplated how much knowledge you have stuffed into that brain of yours?
Well, I know that my wife thinks I have too much because I usually don't remember to do things around the house that she asks.
Join the club.
Yes.
But you seem to have an incredible memory.
I guess I don't know how or where it developed. I know that when I was working in the western suburbs of Chicago, I would do 7 basketball games a week with maybe 10 to 12 different teams involved in those games. So memorization skills were something I really had to develop, really in any play-by-play, but certainly back then doing high school basketball games. So I guess something has just developed over the years.
How has play-by-play changed over the last 30 years?
I don't know that it's changed a whole lot on the radio side. I think on the television side it's become more conversational. And I think on TV, the star is the analyst, whereas in radio, it's the play-by-play guy. Because on radio, you're painting the picture in people's minds as to what's going out on the field or the ice or the court. On television, the play-by-play guy is pretty much a human highlight pen, the yellow thing that you mark in your books and stuff, because you can already see what's going on. You're just enhancing it.
A big part of what you do is describing the action of the game, the actual play in the game. But that's only a fraction of what you really do. What more do you do?
I want to try to make the fan listening on the radio in their cars or at home or online feel like they're at the game. I mean, I'll talk about during a Bees game, I'll talk about, you know, the games being played or underneath the sea of azure blue with fleecy white clouds dotting the sky, or the shadows are creeping over second base, or, you know, during a football game, talk about the wind direction. Just make it feel like that they're at the game. Just little side comments along the way that might not have anything to do with the actual playing of the game, but it's a part of the atmosphere.
Have you ever run out of things to say?
Thankfully, no. I'm dreading that day. If that ever happens, I think I'm going to have to call it a day. But no, I have not at this point. There are times that, like I say, my wife wishes I had stopped talking, but that's about it.
With baseball, football, basketball, and throw in all the other freelance things, hockey, and whenever other things come up, you must be on the road almost constantly all the time. Does it leave you time to do anything else in your life?
Really not a whole lot. I stopped playing golf a few years ago between my back and just not having time to play it. And like I say, spending 120 nights a year in a hotel room. I guess one of the things I've kind of picked up as a hobby, on the Food Network, there's a television show called Diners, Drive-Ins, and Dives, of which I'm a big fan. And because of my travels, I keep track, and I've been to 166 restaurants that have been featured on the show, including all the ones that have been on the show in the Salt Lake City area. And, you know, because when I travel, I'd rather eat local than chain, but local can be iffy too, and I figure if it's been on the show, it's pretty good.
You have called 3,620 games for the Bees in your career now. Tell us, how did you get to that milestone? How did you make that happen?
Well, I was very fortunate when we found out that the Portland Beavers were going to move to Salt Lake for the start of the 1994 season. There were 2 entities that were looking to get the broadcast rights to the games, and one of them was the Jazz station at the time, the old Kissin' 570. And back then, Scott Layton was then the general manager of the Jazz, always used to have that fundraising golf tournament for muscular dystrophy. And so, as usual at a charity golf outing, there was a backup at the par 3 hole, and I turned to my 2 bosses, Randy Rigby of the Jazz and Randy Rogers of the radio station, and said, hey, why don't you let me go up to Portland, broadcast the last 2 regular season games there before they move, and that will give the fans here a feel for what's coming. It'll also show the ownership there that we're the serious ones about the broadcast rights. You know, it turns out there were no doors to the press box at this old park in Portland, and the owner, Joe Busis, listened, and I was told later, he said that it was so good that whichever station had me would get the broadcast rights. And fortunately, I stayed with where I was because I had been out of a full-time job in broadcasting for 19 months. And so I felt a loyalty to the Jazz and to the radio station, and so that's how it started.
3,620 games is nothing to sneeze at. That has to be some kind of record. Is that a record of some?
The only record that I know of is it's the most games with one team within the state of Utah in sportscasting, because I know Hot Rod was about 3,100 plus for the Jazz, and I don't think anybody else has come close. I mean, obviously guys like Paul James and Bill Marcroft did them for years, but there's only 40 college games a year between football and basketball.
Right. Right. So how far are you going to go down this road? Are you going to go to 6,000, 9,000, 12,000?
That's a good question. I guess as long as they keep asking me back, I'll probably stick around for as long as I can. I will certainly be my most difficult critic when it comes to when I feel myself slipping. And when I feel I'm not providing the listener a proper broadcast, I think that's when I'll decide to hang it up.
If you had to alliterate what sets you apart from other play-by-play announcers, what would you say that is?
Bob, that's really a hard question, because I don't think I separate myself. There's some really good play-by-play people here in the state of Utah, and I just am happy to consider myself to be one of them.
Do you guys get together often? Do you communicate with each other?
Yes, we do. As a matter of fact, we've had breakfast together before. We try to meet together maybe once a year as a group and have breakfast and swap stories and what have you. And you know, it's just a lot of fun. It's a very small community, small fraternity, and we certainly have the stories to tell, and most of them are true.
Most of them. Well, Steve Klauke, voice of the Salt Lake Bees and the Weber State Wildcats, thank you so much for being part of 3 Questions.
Bob, my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.